Dr. Alastor Glendon felt his fists clench as he saw the church in the distance. There was no mistaking the dark energy he felt emanating out of the building, or the wooden structures that had been erected outside. Men in robes patrolled the perimeter, wielding shotguns and rifles, chanting to themselves in deranged nonsense. The wooden panels of the church were leaking, weeping out some repulsive black slime. Despite it being the dead of night and flaming pyres burning brightly all around the church, the flesh blobs of the broken day dared not approach, as though they could sense the power and limitless cruelty of the thing inside the church. Yes, this could only be the work of the Mask, the next one on his revenge list. Having already crossed off the anomaly that had once killed him, SCP-036, the Old Man, he had only 2 left. And today, he was determined to make it 1. Glendon crept closer to the church, wrapped in his armor of shadows, offering both protection and stealth. He would need it here. SCP-914 may have given him mastery of shadows, but the being waiting for him inside the church commanded a far deeper and more primal form of darkness. In all likelihood, it already knew he was coming, and it was looking forward to the meeting. As Glendon got closer, he could see all the hallmarks of the Mask's influence, most of all, excessive cruelty. People were dead and dying, crucified on sloppily made wooden crosses, with placards hanging around their necks and proclaiming their supposed crimes. Alastor could make out weakness, kindness, and mercy. Typical. There were huge cages erected behind the church. Glendon could see the poor prisoners huddled within, filthy and clothed in rags. He saw 2 of the robed cultists drag one of them out and beat him with truncheons until he went half limp, then carried him off to the church's grand entrance. The people left behind in the cages screamed his name. A family member, probably. Even with all the horrors Alastor had seen, he couldn't just stand by and let this happen. If he did, he wouldn't be worthy of the place he was trying to return to. Slinking past the patrolling guards, he found his way to the entrance and slipped inside. The interior of the church was every bit as nightmarish and profane as he expected. Every cross had been inverted. Every stained glass window was changed to images of sadism and cruelty. Violent murals made of black slime stretched all over the walls. Rows of hooded figures were bowed in prayer at the feet of the monster sitting on a makeshift throne where once had been the altar. A rotting body wearing SCP-035, the Possessive Mask. Alastor knew the Mask was a charmer, a trickster, a deceiver, and he didn't intend to give it a chance. He raised a hand and fired an arcing blade made of shadow at the rotted form, cleaving the throne in half and, to the researcher's surprise, shattering the Mask. He realized a second too late, it was a decoy. Suddenly, he felt a pressure all around his body as his arms became bolted to his sides. His legs went pencil straight and stuck together, as though tied with invisible rope. His bound body began to float off the ground and slowly swiveled around. There stood SCP-035, wearing the body of the poor prisoner his minions had just brought in. It was a mysterious, anomalous object of truly diabolical power, capable of instantly killing its hosts and totally subsuming their bodies to give it more power. The kind of power it was using to subdue Dr. Alastor Glendon right now.
Alastor, old sport, what a delightful surprise,
the Mask said with a haughty laugh.
If I knew I'd be entertaining today, I would have tidied up a little.
He tried to move, but the Mask's sorcery was even more powerful than his. In its presence, his shadow powers were as useless as anything else, especially when it was being fed by the devotion of so many willing cultists. "How about you let me out of here and we can have a civil conversation?" Alastor said. The Mask laughed again, as the cultists rose from their prostration and huddled around the ground below Alastor as though ready to catch him. "Like the civil conversation you had with 106? The Mask asked. "Don't think I'd hold that against you, by the way. I always thought the old man was a terrible bore." It really did know everything. The Mask snapped its stolen fingers, and Alastor felt a profound change. His shadow powers, the thing that had gotten him this far, were suddenly stolen from him, sapped away by the arcane abilities of the horror from Alagata. Its supernatural grip fell away after that, and Alastor fell into the waiting arms of the cultists below. As the stresses and pains of the preceding weeks, which his powers had insulated him from, all came flooding back, the poor man could barely move. They had him at their mercy.
Throw him into the cages. He won't give you any trouble, the mask said. We'll use him in tomorrow morning's ritual. It'd be a shame to kill one like this so unceremoniously.
As the cultists obediently dragged Alastor from the church, he gathered up just enough strength to yell back in spite.
You won't get away with this, you bastard!
He roared.
You'll pay for the deal you made!
The mask just waved a rotting hand and laughed. His screams of protest and spiteful kicks did little to dissuade his kidnappers. Before long, the doors to one of the cages behind the church were yanked open, and Dr. Alastor Glendon was thrown inside. The thought horrified him. After everything he'd survived, everything he'd been through, the sun, the sarkists, the flesh that hates, the old man, would he even spend the remaining hours in this cage before being sacrificed by cultists of an evil mask in the morning? He grabbed at the bars and rattled them with all of his human strength. Nothing. They remained firm. Dr. Glendon collapsed against the front of the cage, eyes welling with tears, and slumped to the ground. Glendon began to weep. All this effort, all this pain, all this sacrifice, and he still failed.
Oh, can it, Glendon? Said a voice from further into the cage. You know I can't stand to see a grown man cry unless I'm the reason he's crying.
Glendon looked up, wiping the tears from his eyes to better make out the figure emerging from the dark. It was, to his immense relief, a familiar face. Foundation researcher Dr. Clef, wearing shabby post-apocalyptic clothes and sporting rugged stubble. He had never been so happy to see another researcher in his life. It turns out that Alastor Glendon hadn't been the only one who roamed the wasteland of the world that was in search of bad guys to take vengeance out on. As soon as the Foundation fell and the veil was broken, Dr. Clef had already given his 2 weeks' notice to the remains of the O5 Council, grabbed a bag full of weapons out of the Site-19 armory, assembled himself a makeshift skin-covering suit, and set off into the world to live his Fallout dreams. As different groups of interest regrouped and rose to power in the Foundation's power vacuum, Clef made sure to put them in their place. He infiltrated Chaos Insurgency anomalous supply runs and gunned down everyone on the courier teams. He led single-handed assaults on Sarkic strongholds. He claimed to have killed either Marshall, Carter, or Dark during the madness, but wouldn't say which one. However, much like Alastor Glendon, he'd met his match while trying to lead an assault on the Mask's profane anti-church. He'd fallen under the influence of the creature's psychic thrall and was overwhelmed by its minions. He was thrown into that cage 3 days before Alastor arrived and hadn't done much to improve his attitude. And Dr. Clef with a bad attitude was not something you wanted to mess with. He helped Alastor to his feet, and the two shared a manly hug. With two brilliant and off-kilter ex-Foundation minds together, they might actually have a chance of matching the occult intelligence of SCP-035. Glendon told Clef about everything that happened, how Dr. Gears in 914 had given him mastery of shadow, and how the mask had stolen it. If they were able to get his powers back, they might be in there with a chance. But first, they needed a plan to escape the cage, and thankfully, Clef had one, just not one that Glendon was going to enjoy acting out. Some of the robed patrolling guards heard the sounds of a scuffle inside the cage and ran over, fearing an escape attempt. Instead, they saw Dr. Clef kicking the tar out of Dr. Glendon, who was curled up in a ball on the floor.
That'll teach you to talk smack about the Eagles!
Dr. Clef yelled between kicks. While the cultists didn't much care for the well-being of their prisoners for its own sake, they knew that their master preferred healthy sacrifices. They were more fun to torment. Two of the robed guards opened the cage and slipped inside to pull Dr. Clef away from the prisoner he seemed to be relentlessly beating. That's when they turned the tables. Glendon, while still on the ground, pulled out a pocket knife Clef gave him and stabbed it through one of the cultists' feet, pinning him to the ground. The cloaked figure dropped his submachine gun in the panic, and Glendon scrambled to grab it. The other cultist, wearing a Benelli pump-action shotgun, turned around to intervene, but before he could fire off a shot, Clef grabbed his head from behind and snapped his neck with a rough twist. 173 would be proud. As the cultist's body fell, Clef liberated the shotgun with ease, rubbing his face lovingly against its wood-effect finish.
"Oh, shoddy. Beautiful, beautiful shoddy,"
he purred. Glendon hopped up and brained the remaining cultist with the back of his weapon. Now both of the Foundation researchers were armed, and the door to their cage was left open. "I'm glad that worked," Alastor said, rubbing the aching side of his head with his free hand. "But did you actually have to kick me?" "Had to make it believable, Glendon," he said, pumping his new shotgun.
"Now let's rock and roll."
The two researchers burst out of the cage and began their righteous rampage of revenge. They both knew now that sneak attacks wouldn't do any good, so they were better off unleashing their inner boondock saints and kicking down the door, guns blazing. The sudden ferocity of the attack threw the cultists into chaos. They scrambled to grab their own weapons and zero in on Glendon and Clef, but the two of them had Foundation combat training and mighty scores to settle. Glendon unleashed hell from his submachine gun, and Clef popped cultist after cultist with his shotgun like he was a sugar-rushing child at a carnival shooting gallery. It wasn't long until they were strutting towards the church, felled cultists on every side of them. They kicked open the doors to the main hall and ran in, guns blazing. The mask, now occupying a new host, was standing upside down on the ceiling. "Sorry, 035, Glendon said. "The old man already did that one. You'll need to try some new tricks." The masked figure shrugged and extended a hand. To Glendon's horror, a shadow blade fired from it, heading straight towards him and Clef. They jumped in either direction at the crucial moment as the shadow cleaved the ground between them. It seemed that the mask wasn't above plagiarism, which could be added to the bottom of its extremely long list of crimes. As Glendon and Clef ran to either side of the church, the mask flipped and floated down to the ground. The two researchers peppered it with gunfire from both sides, but a psychic barrier between it and them seemed to block the projectiles in midair. The researchers hid behind the support pillars, reloading their weapons with frantic energy. The mask laughed, summoning more blades of shadow that floated around it, ready to strike the second either of the researchers approached.
"I suppose you're here because of your brother, Alastor," the mask said, peering out of its eyeless face into the darkness around the church. "I understand why you're feeling a little raw about the switch-up, old chap, but it was a fair deal. I suppose you probably think I poured poison into the other Dr. Glendon's ear, but no, dear Edward came to me. The world being what it was when the sun went septic, he wanted a way out. A better place, a brighter place. The place where you went after the old man killed you. He asked me if there was a way that the brothers Glendon could switch places, and my only crime was being honest with him. He put in the work, and that's my fault. How silly. How self-serving. Maybe this world is the hell you always deserved, Alastor. You really think vengeance is another path to heaven?"
Clef pumped his shotgun again. "That thing really loves the sound of its own voice." Glendon didn't say a thing. The words of the mask had almost broken him. Could it be true? Could his own brother have betrayed him like that, willing to make a deal with the mask to steal his place in the afterlife and cast him into the horrors of the new world? Alastor cocked his submachine gun. He'd have to ask his dear brother himself. The two researchers ran out from their cover and opened fire on the mask's host. Most were blocked. Some got through and hit the body, but the mask seemed unfazed. It released another barrage of shadow attacks when the two researchers dodged for cover. As they checked their ammo, they saw that they were out. Things were looking bleak for our duo of heroes. That's when Dr. Clef had an idea. He would break the mask's concentration, the seat of its psychic powers, with something truly and utterly unexpected. "Hey, Glendon," Clef said, his face spreading into a broad grin. "Tell people that I did this, and that it was incredible." Before Alastor could say another word, Dr. Clef rose up and locked eyes on the mask. He dropped his shotgun. Even the mask seemed oddly surprised by that, and Clef took advantage of that surprise, running for the demon with his fist cocked back. At the top of his lungs, Dr. Clef screamed, "World Star!" and punched the mask in its cursed porcelain face. The contact caused a burst of psychic energy that killed Clef instantly, but in the process, the mask lost its mental place, and Dr. Glendon got his powers back. "Thank you, Alto," he said under his breath. Before the mask could regain its footing, Glendon released a volley of powerful shadow attacks, completely decimating the mask's host body. It fell to the ground, a piece of hateful porcelain leaking corrosive black mucus. With a dead cult and an empty church, Alastor was fine leaving it in such a sorry state. He had a more pressing matter. He needed to go to the gate and find his worthless, no-good brother again, and destroy the only thing that stood in his way. Now go check out What If SCP-035 Fought the Mask, and What If SCP-999 Wore SCP-035 for more.